My name is Lucinda Ambar. I'm 36 years old. I live just outside Manchester. I've been married for 11 years to a man who believes in building things slowly. Homes, businesses, trust. I work in compliance consulting, which means my job is to see what others overlook. Patterns, paper trails, silence between statements. Most people describe me the same way. Calm, reliable, a little reserved. Some mistake that for softness. Some assume it means I won't push back. I don't blame them. I don't argue loudly. I don't compete for attention at family dinners. I don't correct every false assumption. I observe. For most of my life, that worked in my favor. Being underestimated is strangely comfortable. It allows you to move without resistance. But a few years ago, my younger sister decided to weaponize something deeply personal about me. She told people, our relatives, mutual friends, even acquaintances from church, that I was infertile, that my marriage was strained, that my husband was disappointed. She told it as sympathy gossip, the kind that travels wrapped in concern. None of it was true, and she didn't just say it once. She repeated it enough times that it began to feel real in rooms I hadn't even entered. At first, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was insecurity, projection, a passing cruelty that would dissolve on its own. It didn't. What she didn't realize was this. While she was speaking, I was listening. While she was speculating, I was verifying. And while she was trying to fracture my marriage with rumors, she was unknowingly leaving fingerprints. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about proof. It's about what happens when someone underestimates the person who keeps records. When someone assumes silence equals ignorance. When gossip collides with documentation. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic public takedowns, no social media exposés. There was simply truth, presented at the right moment. And once truth enters a room, it doesn't need to shout. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how it unfolded. Not to humiliate her, not to glorify myself, but to show what quiet dominance actually looks like. Have you ever been misrepresented by someone who thought you'd never defend yourself? To my family, I was the stable one, not the exciting one, not the dramatic one, not the fragile one. The stable one. When we were children, my sister Isabella was the sun, bright, emotional, constantly pulling gravity toward her. If she was upset, the house shifted around her. If she succeeded, everyone celebrated loudly. I learned early that my value came from not needing anything. I did well in school. Quietly. I handled my own disappointments. Quietly. I moved out at 22. Quietly. When I married Daniel at 25, no one questioned it. No dramatic objections, no warnings, just approving nods. Lucinda makes sensible choices, my mother would say. Sensible. It sounds like a compliment, but it carries something else underneath it. Predictability. Containment. At family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks, checking on grandparents, cleaning up plates before anyone asked. When Isabella arrived late, flustered and emotional about a breakup or a new dream venture, attention pivoted. I never competed for it, partly because I didn't want to, partly because I understood something she didn't. Attention is noisy, influence is quiet. For years, our dynamic stayed comfortable in its imbalance. Isabella would vent about boyfriends. I would listen. She'd borrow money. I'd remind her gently to repay it. She'd cry about being misunderstood. I'd reassure her she wasn't. People often assume that the quieter sibling is weaker, but silence doesn't equal submission. Sometimes it's simply calibration. By my early 30s, Daniel and I had built a life that looked unremarkable from the outside. A modest house, a stable income, predictable holidays, Sunday routines. We weren't flashy, we were solid, and solidity can irritate people who thrive on fluctuation. I didn't realize when that irritation began. In hindsight, it probably started when Isabella's own marriage began to show cracks. Small arguments, financial strain, questions about children. She would sit at my kitchen island, stirring tea she never drank, and ask pointed questions. Don't you ever feel bored? Isn't it strange you haven't had children yet? You're 35 now, Lou. Always wrapped in concern, always framed as curiosity. I answered honestly. We weren't rushing. We were planning. We were fine. But I noticed something subtle. When relatives asked about grandchildren, Isabella would glance at me before answering for herself. Well, some people just aren't meant to be mothers, she said once lightly. Everyone laughed awkwardly. I smiled. I didn't correct her. Because it was easier not to, and because I trusted that truth doesn't require constant defense. Looking back, that was my first miscalculation. Not that I stayed quiet, but I assumed my silence would be interpreted as confidence. In reality, it created space, and space invites stories. To them, I was dependable, unshakable, slightly distant. The sister who would be fine no matter what. They never asked whether I wanted to be fine. They never considered that being stable doesn't mean being invulnerable. I wasn't invisible. I was simply assumed. And when you are assumed long enough, people stop checking facts. They start writing narratives. And I didn't realize a narrative had already begun forming around me. Not until I heard it repeated back. The first time I heard it, it didn't even come from her. It came from my cousin Elise. We were at a christening. Pale blue ribbons. 2 sweet cake. The usual circle of women near the buffet is discussing sleep schedules and nursery paint colors. Elise touched my arm gently and lowered her voice. "I'm so sorry, Lou. I didn't know." I blinked. "Didn't know what?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "About the fertility issues." The word landed softly, carefully, like something fragile. I didn't react immediately. That's one of my strengths. I give myself 3 seconds before responding to anything unexpected. "I don't have fertility issues," I said evenly. Her brows knit together. "Oh, Isabella said—" "Of course she did." Elise looked embarrassed. "She told Aunt Miriam you and Daniel were trying for years and struggling." Trying for years. Struggling. It was detailed, confident, specific. That's what startled me. Gossip that is vague can be dismissed. But this had structure, timeline, emotional framing. I smiled politely. "We're not trying at the moment." It was the simplest truth I could offer without escalating the moment. Elise nodded quickly, relieved. "Oh, that's good. I just thought, well, you know." I did know. She wasn't malicious. She was operating on secondhand sympathy. The kind that spreads quickly because it allows people to feel compassionate. I excused myself and found Isabella near the pram display, cooing over the baby. "Can I borrow you for a second?" I asked. She followed me into the hallway, expression already guarded. "What's wrong? Why are you telling people I'm infertile?" There it was. Direct, calm. She laughed. Actually laughed. "Lucinda, don't be dramatic." I'm not being dramatic. Elise just offered condolences." Her eyes flickered. A quick calculation. "I said you were having trouble. It's not the same thing." "We're not." "Well, you don't have kids, Lou. People ask." I just gave them something to say. Something to say, as if my body were a conversational placeholder. I kept my voice steady. "That's not yours to give." She crossed her arms. Defensive now. I was being protective. "You hate talking about it." "There's nothing to talk about." She tilted her head, studying me. "See, that's what I mean. You shut down." That was the pivot. In her version, my boundary became evidence of secrecy. "I don't shut down," I replied. "I choose what's private." She shrugged. "Fine. I won't say anything again." Dismissive, casual, as if she were granting me a favor. We walked back into the party separately. On the surface, it ended there. No raised voices, no scene, no public correction. But something subtle shifted in me. Not anger, alertness. Because the way she'd delivered the story, it hadn't sounded improvised. It sounded practiced. And I began to notice something else. When someone brought up children around me, there was now a pause, a softness in tone, a certain pity in their eyes. Pity I had not earned. Pity I had not authorized. It was small, manageable, but it was a cut. And small cuts, when repeated, don't stay small. I told myself she'd stop. I wanted to believe it was careless, not strategic. But part of me, the part that works in compliance and pattern recognition, knew better. Stories don't spread that smoothly without repetition. And repetition means intention. I didn't confront her again. Not yet. I watched. I listened. Because sometimes the first cut isn't meant to wound. It's meant to test how much you'll tolerate. And I had just shown her I wouldn't make a scene. After the christening, I expected the rumor to fade. Rumors usually require oxygen, reaction, outrage, correction. I gave it none. For a few weeks, nothing obvious happened. Then it resurfaced in smaller, subtler ways. At Sunday lunch, my mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know," she said gently, "there are so many options these days." Options. I knew exactly what she meant. I buttered my bread slowly. Options for what? For assistance, if you need it. There it was again. That softness. That careful sympathy. "I don't," I replied. She looked confused. "Isabella said you were exploring treatments." Treatments. Not having trouble, not maybe trying. Treatments. The narrative had escalated. I didn't correct her in front of everyone. I could feel Daniel glance at me from across the table, waiting for my cue. He trusted my tempo. "We're not pursuing anything." I said calmly. If that changes, we'll let you know. The table quieted for a moment. Then someone shifted the conversation to property prices. But the damage wasn't in the moment, it was in the normalization. The idea had already settled into the family ecosystem. It had weight now. A few weeks later, a family friend approached Daniel privately at a barbecue. I found out afterward. He told me that evening, while we loaded the dishwasher. Mark asked if I was holding up okay. I paused. Holding up? He said it must be difficult supporting you. Supporting me. As though I were ill. Fragile. Burdensome. Daniel didn't look angry. He looked puzzled. I told him there's nothing to support, he said carefully. But he seemed convinced. Conviction without evidence is powerful. It means someone has been repeating the story consistently. I felt something unfamiliar then. Not hurt. Not rage. A kind of intellectual irritation. Isabella wasn't just gossiping. She was constructing a framework. In that framework, I was quietly broken. Daniel was quietly disappointed. Our marriage was quietly strained. It was subtle character erosion, and the brilliance of it was this. It made me look unreasonable if I denied it too strongly, because who reacts aggressively to concern? If I dismissed it too firmly, I'd appear defensive. If I ignored it, the story would continue. If I joked about it, it would reinforce the idea that I was coping. It was a perfect trap of tone. I began to replay conversations in my head. Her questions about boredom, her comments about age, her casual line at the christening. Some people just aren't meant to be mothers. At the time, they'd felt irritated. Now they looked intentional. I considered confronting her again. But something stopped me. Not fear. Strategy. Because if I confronted her emotionally, she could reframe it. Lucinda is sensitive. She's under pressure. She's struggling. Instead, I did what I always do when something feels unstable. I gathered data. I paid attention who said what, when they said it, how consistent the phrasing was. And the phrasing was remarkably consistent, which meant she wasn't improvising. She was rehearsing. There's a particular kind of disrespect that becomes dangerous only when you accept it as background noise. I realized I had been accepting it. I had been rationalizing her behavior as insecurity. I had been telling myself she doesn't mean harm. But harm doesn't require malice. It requires repetition, and repetition was happening. The final confirmation came when an old university friend messaged me out of nowhere. I heard about the IVF. If you ever need to talk, IVF. That wasn't vague. That was specific. Medical. Invented. I stared at the message for a long time, because now it wasn't family gossip. It was external. It was my reputation. And once a narrative leaves your immediate circle, it stops being family drama. It becomes a public identity. That night, for the first time, I didn't rationalize her behavior. I didn't minimize it. I didn't excuse it. I simply acknowledged it. She wasn't being careless. She was being deliberate. And if she was deliberate, then I needed to stop being passive. Not reactive, not explosive, but intentional. Because silence, when misinterpreted, becomes permission. And I had been very quiet. There's a moment, quiet almost invisible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. My mother had invited us for dinner. Isabella arrived late, flushed and theatrical, as usual, apologizing for traffic that no one else seemed to experience. Conversation drifted toward children again. Someone's toddler biting at nursery, someone else's pregnancy announcement, and then my aunt leaned toward me with a softness that felt rehearsed. Lucinda, darling, have you considered seeing someone privately? Sometimes NHS waiting lists are dreadful. There it was again. Assumption as fact. Concern as performance. I felt every pair of eyes turn, not aggressively, just expectantly, as if they were waiting for me to confirm the storyline. In that moment, I saw it clearly. To them, I wasn't the woman who simply hadn't chosen to have children yet. I was the woman trying and failing. The woman was too dignified to admit heartbreak. The woman Daniel was patiently enduring. It was a narrative that made everyone feel compassionate. It gave Isabella relevance as the informed sister. It positioned me as tragic but stoic. I had been assigned the role of quiet disappointment, and because I rarely corrected people publicly, the role had solidified. I smiled lightly. There's nothing to wait for, I said. We're not undergoing treatment. A slight ripple of confusion. Oh, my aunt said, glancing briefly at Isabella. Just a flicker. But I caught it. Isabella recovered quickly. Well, you've been looking into options, haven't you, Lou? Her tone was light, curious, harmless. But it was a trap. If I said no, she could imply denial. If I said yes, she'd be validated. I looked at her directly. No, I said evenly. We haven't. Silence settled for half a second too long, and then someone changed the subject. But something inside me had shifted. Not anger, clarity, because I finally understood what was happening. She wasn't trying to destroy me in one dramatic act. She was reshaping perception incrementally. If enough people believed I was fragile, my strength would look unnatural. If enough people believed Daniel was disappointed, our marriage would look strained. If enough people believed I was hiding something, my privacy would look suspicious. It was a subtle psychological positioning, and I had been participating by remaining agreeable. There's a strange comfort in being the reliable one. It spares you conflict. It keeps family dynamics stable, but reliability can be exploited. I was useful, predictable, non-reactive, which meant I was safe to narrate over. That night, driving home, Daniel finally asked what he had been holding back. "Do you want me to say something next time?" His voice was calm, protective but not possessive. I thought about it carefully. "No," I said, because this wasn't his battle. And it wasn't about defending my fertility. It was about reclaiming authorship. You can't argue someone out of a story they enjoy telling. You have to change the evidence. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why Isabella was doing this. And I started asking a more useful question. What did she gain? Attention, sympathy, relevance, perhaps even a distraction from her own struggles. Once I understood the gain, I understood the leverage. And once you understand leverage, you stop reacting emotionally. You begin evaluating strategically. I had been assigned a role, but roles only persist if the actor keeps performing them. That night, I decided on something very small and very important. I would no longer perform. Not defensively, not dramatically, simply, differently. Silence would remain, but it would no longer be passive. It would be deliberate, and she wouldn't notice the difference at first. People rarely do, until it's too late. The shift didn't happen in a confrontation. It didn't happen at a dinner table. It didn't happen in front of witnesses. It happened alone, in my office, on a gray Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing compliance documentation for a private healthcare client, specifically protocols around patient confidentiality and data disclosure. Dry work, precise work, the kind that rewards attention. Halfway through a paragraph about unauthorized sharing of medical information, I paused. Not because of the client, because of the irony. Medical privacy is sacred. In the UK, it's fiercely protected. Records cannot be shared without explicit consent. Even acknowledging someone is a patient somewhere can be a breach. And yet, my sister had casually narrated an entire fictional fertility journey on my behalf. IVF treatments, timelines. She had borrowed the authority of medicine to strengthen her gossip. That was the moment something crystallized. She wasn't just speculating about my life. She was constructing a medically specific lie, and specificity leaves trails. Up until that day, I had been responding emotionally, quietly, but emotionally. I'd been asking myself how to correct perception. On that Thursday, I stopped thinking about perception, and I started thinking about verifiability. If someone spreads a vague rumor, you defend yourself socially. If someone spreads a structured falsehood, you defend yourself factually. I opened my planner, the slim black leather one I've carried for years, and began writing dates. Christening, Sunday lunch, barbecue conversation with Mark, university friend message mentioning IVF. Patterns matter. If the story was circulating consistently, then it had a source point and amplification points. And if it was amplified externally, it meant Isabella had likely repeated it beyond the family, which meant she had confidence. People are only confident repeating medical claims when they believe no one will challenge them with documentation. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself something simple. What would happen if I required proof? Not publicly, privately, because if she had told people I was undergoing IVF, that implied clinics, consultations, appointments. In today's world, medical narratives intersect with financial ones. IVF is expensive. It leaves invoices, payment trails, and referrals. And while I had no intention of invading anyone's privacy, I did understand one thing clearly. If she had been discussing fertility treatments in detail, there was a high probability she was projecting from her own life. Projection is rarely random. It's specific, and specificity often belongs to experience. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still, very still, because if Isabella was experiencing fertility challenges of her own and redirecting the narrative onto me, then this wasn't random cruelty. It was displacement, which meant two things were true at once. She was hurting, and she was harming. Compassion and accountability are not mutually exclusive. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsibility. If I moved impulsively, I would look vindictive. If I moved carelessly, I could damage something irreversibly. So I did what I do best. I waited. But this time I wasn't waiting in confusion. I was waiting with awareness. There's a difference between passive silence and strategic silence. Passive silence hopes the problem disappears. Strategic silence prepares for when it doesn't. I began paying closer attention to financial conversations, to offhand comments Isabella made about clinic waiting lists, about friends considering private options, about debt, about stress. Details that once felt like background noise now felt like pieces. And the more I observed, the clearer something became. The story about me had the texture of someone describing their own reality, which meant the shift wasn't about correcting gossip. It was about uncovering motive. And once you understand motive, you stop asking, why me? You start asking, what is she hiding? That Thursday, I closed my planner and made a decision. I would not confront. I would not accuse. I would confirm, because quiet dominance doesn't begin with exposure. It begins with certainty. And I intended to be certain. Once you stop reacting, people get comfortable. That's the fascinating part. When you don't push back, they assume you've accepted the narrative. When you don't argue, they assume you agree. And when you don't correct them loudly, they assume you can't. After that Thursday in my office, I changed nothing on the surface. I still attended family dinners. I still replied politely to concerned messages. I still smiled when someone said, "You're so brave." But internally, everything was different. I was no longer absorbing, I was cataloging. At a cousin's birthday gathering, I deliberately stood slightly outside the main circle and listened. Isabella was speaking animatedly about how difficult fertility journeys can be, not naming me directly, but heavily implying. "She's private about it," she said softly. "I don't think she wants everyone to know how hard it's been." The irony almost impressed me, privacy weaponized as confirmation. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I watched the audience, the nods, the sympathetic tilts of heads. The way Daniel's name was mentioned was gentle, as though he were enduring something heavy. That was new. The narrative had matured. It wasn't just about my body anymore. It was about my marriage. Later that evening, a family friend asked Daniel, "Have you two considered counseling? These things can strain even the strongest couples." Counseling, strain. Language spreads like dye in water, gradually, invisibly. Daniel handled it calmly. "We're fine," he said without elaboration. He didn't over-explain. He didn't justify. We had agreed on that. Clarity without defensiveness. That was our approach. At home, I asked him something I had avoided before. "Has she ever spoken to you directly about this?" He shook his head. "No, only about her own stress." Her own stress. I let that settle. The more she painted me as quietly suffering, the more insulated she became from scrutiny. People don't question the narrator when they're busy sympathizing with the subject. It was elegant in a way. But elegance without truth collapses eventually. My silence now had purpose. When relatives offered clinic recommendations, I thanked them and changed the subject. When someone sent an article about fertility diets, I responded with a neutral emoji and no elaboration. I stopped clarifying entirely, and that's when something subtle shifted. Without my gentle denials, the story lost friction. It grew bolder. Specific clinic names began appearing in conversations. "Didn't Lucinda look into Manchester Reproductive Center?" someone asked casually at lunch. That was the first time a real clinic was mentioned. Not by me, by someone repeating something they had heard. I made a mental note. Specificity is evidence. The more detailed the lie becomes, the easier it is to dismantle. But dismantling too early would look reactive. I needed confirmation, not an assumption. Around this time, I noticed Isabella becoming more volatile in other areas. Snappier, financially anxious, defensive about small questions. Projection often intensifies when the source feels threatened. I didn't confront her mood swings. I didn't comfort them either. I stayed steady. There is a particular kind of power in emotional neutrality. It unsettles people who expect either submission or outrage. At one dinner, she finally asked me directly, in front of everyone, "Lou, how are you really doing?" The room went quiet. It was framed as compassion, but it was bait. I met her gaze and answered simply, "I'm doing very well." No elaboration, no irony, just truth. And for a flicker of a second, I saw something in her expression. Not guilt, not empathy, calculation, because she realized something had changed. I wasn't defending. I wasn't protesting. I wasn't correcting. I was allowing the story to expand unchecked. And expansion creates exposure. Silence had stopped being my shield. It had become my strategy. And she still believed it was a weakness. That misunderstanding would matter later. Because when someone underestimates your capacity for restraint, they never prepare for your precision. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like ordinary life is continuing. That was my advantage. No one questions the quiet woman with a planner. No one interrogates the consultant who asks neutral questions. No one suspects the sister who appears unbothered. What they never noticed was that my silence had structure. The first thing I did was simple. I documented every instance I could confirm. Dates, locations, exact phrases. Who heard it? Who repeated it? Not obsessively, just methodically. When you work in compliance, you learn that patterns matter more than isolated events. A single misstatement can be dismissed. A repeated narrative across multiple witnesses becomes demonstrable intent, and intent changes everything. The second thing I did was pay attention to the clinic names being mentioned. Manchester Reproductive Center, a private fertility consultant in Cheshire, a London-based IVF specialist. These weren't random guesses from relatives. They were too specific, too geographically scattered. Specificity means familiarity. I didn't search social media. I didn't stalk her accounts. That would have been impulsive. Instead, I observed real-world details. At dinner one evening, Isabella mentioned needing to transfer funds before Monday. She seemed tense about it. Her husband, Oliver, barely looked up. A week later, she complained about private healthcare being extortionate. Then, offhandedly, she said something that caught my attention completely. I can't believe how invasive egg retrieval is. The room went quiet for a second. She recovered quickly. I mean, what I've read about it, for Lou, it's awful. For me, I smiled faintly and sipped my wine. But internally, something aligned. You don't describe egg retrieval as invasive with that tone unless you've sat in a consultation room. That wasn't gossip language. That was experiential language. The third thing I did was consult, carefully, not about her, about myself. I booked a routine appointment with my GP and requested a formal confirmation of my reproductive health status. Standard evaluation, nothing dramatic. The results were straightforward, no fertility issues, no treatment history, no referrals, clean record. I requested documentation, not because I needed validation, but because documentation neutralizes rumor. Then I quietly spoke to a colleague, someone who works adjacent to private medical billing compliance. I didn't mention names. I didn't ask for confidential information. I asked hypotheticals. If someone were undergoing IVF privately, would there typically be payment plans, financial strain? He nodded. Often, it's expensive. Would records be detailed? Extremely. That was enough. The fourth thing I did was something no one would ever suspect. I began gently steering conversations. When someone mentioned IVF around me, I asked neutral, curious questions. Oh, which clinic is reputable for that? Is the waiting list long? Do private consultations require deposits? People love to display knowledge, and knowledge often reveals the source. It became clear that Isabella had been referencing one specific private clinic repeatedly, not because relatives researched it, but because she described it with insider familiarity. Meanwhile, I changed nothing publicly. I didn't announce medical results. I didn't defend myself on social media. I let the narrative continue, because the longer it continued, the more detailed it became. And detailed lies are fragile. Around this time, something else emerged. Oliver stopped attending family events. When he did attend, he seemed withdrawn, tired. At one gathering, I overheard him arguing quietly with Isabella in the kitchen. "We can't keep doing this," he said. "Doing what?" Her voice dropped too low to hear, but the tension was unmistakable. Fertility treatments are emotionally exhausting, financially draining, physically invasive. If she was undergoing IVF privately while projecting the narrative onto me, then her desperation wasn't abstract. It was personal, and desperation makes people reckless. The final confirmation came accidentally. My mother mentioned that Isabella had asked to borrow a substantial amount of money for medical expenses. She didn't specify whose. She didn't need to. In that moment, I understood the full structure. She was undergoing IVF. She was struggling. She was redirecting sympathy toward herself indirectly, by framing me as the tragic sister. And she believed I would never challenge it. Not publicly, not privately, because I was the stable one, the unbothered one, the safe one. What she never noticed was that stability doesn't mean inactivity. It means patience. By the end of that month, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was nearly certain, and certainty is calm. There's no adrenaline in it, no rush, just clarity. The only question left was not whether she was lying. It was whether I would allow the lie to continue shaping my marriage, my reputation, and my identity. Because once you see the architecture of deception, you can't pretend it's accidental. And the longer you wait, the deeper it roots. I closed my planner one evening and realized something simple. I no longer felt confused. I felt prepared. There are two ways to reveal the truth. You can drop it like a grenade, or you can place it gently in the center of a table and let everyone lean in. I chose the table. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. My mother decided to host a large Sunday lunch, extended relatives included. 15 people. Too many for subtlety. Exactly enough for impact. I didn't orchestrate the gathering, but when I saw the guest list, I recognized the alignment. Almost every person who had expressed sympathy. Almost every person had repeated the narrative. And Isabella. I dressed simply. Navy silk blouse, minimal jewelry. Nothing that suggested confrontation. Daniel squeezed my hand before we walked in. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, because this wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. Lunch unfolded predictably. Roast chicken, wine refills, conversations overlapping. And then, inevitably, Aunt Miriam brought it up. "We've all been thinking about you, Lucinda." Soft tone, public concern. The room quieted just slightly. I didn't sigh. I didn't roll my eyes. I placed my fork down carefully. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding." Heads tilted. Isabella's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Oh?" my mother said. "Yes," I continued calmly. "Daniel and I have never undergone fertility treatment. We've never been referred for IVF. We've never even had a consultation." The air changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Isabella laughed lightly. "Lou, no one said you—" I didn't look at her. "I recently had a full medical evaluation," I added. "Everything is perfectly normal. There has never been an issue." I let the sentence settle. Documentation was in my bag. I didn't remove it yet. A cousin frowned slightly. "But I thought—" "Yes," I said gently. "So did I." Silence. This is where most people become defensive. I didn't. "I'm not upset," I continued evenly. "But specific details about IVF, egg retrieval, clinic names, those have been circulating, and they're not about me." The words were precise, not accusatory. Corrective. Isabella's smile thinned. "You're making this bigger than it is," she said softly. "No," I replied, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm making it accurate." That's when the room truly stilled. Accuracy is hard to argue with. My mother looked confused. "Isabella told us—" "I know," I said gently. There it was. The pivot point. I reached into my bag and placed a single folded document on the table, not sliding it toward anyone, just placing it there. "My medical confirmation," I said calmly. "For anyone who's concerned. No drama, no shaking hands. Just a fact. No one touched it. They didn't need to. The implication was enough. Because once you offer proof publicly, the burden shifts." Isabella's voice tightened slightly. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked quietly. I didn't elaborate. I didn't accuse her of projecting. I didn't mention money. I didn't expose her to possible treatments. That wasn't my aim. I simply removed myself from the narrative. And once I did, a vacuum formed. Because if it wasn't me, then who? No one said it aloud. But everyone thought it. And Isabella knew they thought it. She stood abruptly. "I need some air." She left the room. No one followed immediately. The energy wasn't explosive. It was unsettled. My aunt finally spoke. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose things get mixed up." I nodded politely. "Yes," I agreed, "they do." And that was all. No lecture. No humiliation. Just a correction. The most powerful part wasn't the document. It was the composure. If I had been angry, I would have looked unstable. If I had been sarcastic, I would have looked bitter. Instead, I looked certain. And certainty rewrites rooms. Later that afternoon, Daniel and I left early. As we walked to the car, he exhaled. "That was surgical." I smiled faintly. "I didn't want revenge," I said. "I wanted accuracy." Inside the house, conversations would continue. Quiet ones. Reflective ones. The narrative was no longer clean. It had fracture lines now, and fractures spread. I hadn't exposed her. I had simply stepped out of the story. And once the wrong character exits, the spotlight shifts, whether she was ready for it or not. The days after lunch were quieter than I expected. No dramatic phone calls. No explosive confrontations, no apology. Just silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one had weight. My mother called 2 days later. Her voice was careful. "Lucinda, I didn't realize." "I know," I said gently. She hesitated. "Isabella may have implied things." "Yes," I replied, not accusing, not rescuing, just confirming. My mother exhaled softly. "She's been under pressure." There it was. The instinct to protect the louder child. "I'm sure she has," I said. "But that doesn't make the story mine." That was the first time I said it plainly. Not emotional, not sharp, just factual. And for once, my mother didn't argue. Within the family, something subtle shifted. The pity disappeared. The soft tone stopped. No one offered clinic recommendations anymore. Instead, there was distance. Not toward me, toward her. Because once doubt enters a narrative, people begin reevaluating everything attached to it. A week later, Isabella came to my house unannounced. That alone told me everything. She never visits without scheduling. She prefers stages, not private rooms. When I opened the door, she looked tired. Not theatrically tired, actually tired. "You embarrassed me," she said immediately. "I corrected something," I replied. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You made it look like I lied." I held her gaze. "You did. It wasn't cruel. It was calm." Her eyes flashed. "I was protecting you." "No," I said softly. "You were redirecting." That hit, because it was precise. Silence stretched between us. For a moment, I thought she might double down. Instead, something cracked. "They keep asking," she said suddenly. "Everyone keeps asking about children, about timelines, about when, about why not." Her voice trembled, not performatively, reflexively. "And it's easier," she continued, "if it's not about me." There it was. Not villainy, fear, shame, exhaustion. I didn't move toward her. I didn't soften visibly, but I listened. "We've been trying," she said quietly, "for 2 years. "Confirmation. I know," I said. Her head snapped up. "You know?" "I know." She looked startled, not because I had discovered it, but because I hadn't used it. "You could have told them," she whispered. "Yes." Another silence. "You didn't," she said. "No." She swallowed. For the first time in years, there was no performance between us. No role. Just 2 women standing in a truth neither of us had chosen. "I didn't want them looking at me like that," she said. "Like I was broken." I let that sit. "And you were comfortable with them looking at me that way?" I asked gently. She flinched. That was the only sharp edge I allowed. Tears gathered in her eyes. Not dramatic, not loud. "Just tired." "I didn't think you'd care," she said. "You're always fine." That sentence almost hurt more than the lie. Always fine. The role they gave me had protected her, and I had allowed it. "I care," I said quietly. "I just don't collapse." That distinction mattered. She sank into the chair by the window. For the first time, she looked smaller than me. Not weaker, just exposed. "I don't know how to fix it," she admitted. "You start by telling the truth," I said. She nodded slowly, and then she asked something unexpected. "Will you hate me?" I considered it honestly. "No," I said, "but I won't carry it for you anymore." That was the boundary. No punishment, no public shaming, no retaliation, just refusal. In the weeks that followed, she began correcting people herself. Awkwardly at first. "Oh, that was actually me, not Lucinda." The first time I heard she said it, I felt something close to relief. Not victory. Relief. Because light doesn't destroy everything it touches. Sometimes it simply reveals what was already fragile. Our relationship didn't return to childhood dynamics. It became quieter, more honest, less automatic, and strangely, more equal. She no longer narrates to me, and I no longer perform stability for comfort. We are not closer, but we are clearer, and clarity, I've learned, is more durable than harmony. 10 years is enough time for the noise to settle. Not disappear. Settle. The house is quieter now, not because it's empty, but because it holds things that don't need defending. There's a small pair of shoes by the door. Not symbolic, just practical. Daniel is in the garden, arguing gently with a 6-year-old about whether tomatoes count as real vegetables. The debate is intense. The tomato plant is losing. Motherhood came to me eventually, not as urgent, not as a repair, not as proof. It came when I wanted it, and that distinction still matters. Across town, Isabella is packing school lunches of her own. After 2 more rounds of treatment, after debt conversations and therapy, and months of silence, she had twins. I remember the day she called to tell me. Her voice didn't convey joy. It carried relief. We never returned to who we were before the lie. But we built something steadier. Honesty changed the architecture. There are still moments when people bring up how hard those years must have been. They blur our stories sometimes. But now, Isabella corrects them without prompting. "That was me," she says calmly. And there's no shame in her voice anymore. Only ownership. We see each other at holidays. There is warmth, but it is deliberate. Chosen, not assumed. She doesn't narrate my life. I don't absorb her fear. We coexist as 2 women who once misunderstood power. I learned that silence is only strong when it's intentional. She learned that sympathy borrowed becomes debt. Our children play together now. They don't know about the lunches heavy with implication. They don't know about documents placed on tables. They don't know about the afternoon light that exposed everything. They just know cousins. And perhaps that's the quiet redemption. Sometimes I think about that version of myself, the one who sat in her office, realizing specificity leaves trails. I don't feel proud of her. I feel grateful, because she didn't explode. She didn't retaliate. She didn't humiliate. She corrected. And correction, done calmly, echoes longer than anger. Daniel joins me at the kitchen counter now, brushing soil from his hands. "She says tomatoes are fruit," he tells me. "She's technically right," I reply. He smiles. "That's your line." Accuracy, not aggression. That has always been my line. Outside, our daughter runs past the window, shrieking with laughter. The twins chase her. Life moves. Stories fade. But boundaries remain. If I could speak to my younger self, the one absorbing pity she didn't earn, I would tell her this. You don't have to shout to shift a room. You don't have to wound to win. And you don't have to carry someone else's shame to keep the peace. 10 years later, the house is full. Not because a narrative demanded it. Because we chose it. And choice, unlike rumor, never needs defending. Truth does not always soften people. Sometimes it corners them. And when someone feels cornered, they don't confess. They escalate. After the Sunday lunch, the room fractured exactly as I intended. But I miscalculated one thing. Isabella didn't retreat. She recalibrated. The following week, I began receiving messages that were colder than concerned. I didn't realize you'd go that far. That document felt unnecessary. You made Isabella look unstable. Interesting choice of words. Unstable. The narrative hadn't collapsed. It had mutated. Now the story wasn't that I was infertile. It was that I was cruel. Isabella cried to our mother. She cried to her cousins. She cried to friends. Not loudly. Strategically. She humiliated me, she would say softly. I was only trying to protect her privacy. The brilliance of it was painful, because now, to defend myself again would look obsessive. I'd already won once. Anyone who continues after winning looks vindictive. Daniel noticed it before I admitted it. They're avoiding you, he said one evening. Not dramatically. Just observing. Family gatherings became smaller. Invitations slower. Conversations thinner. No one repeated the IVF story anymore. But no one apologized either. Instead, there was a new tone when I entered rooms. Careful. Guarded. As though I might produce documentation at any moment. I hadn't exposed her treatment, but she implied that I had threatened to. She knows things, she told people. Private things. That part was true. In truth, rearranged becomes weaponry. The final shift happened quietly. My mother invited us for Christmas. Then 3 days before, she called. Perhaps this year, she said gently, we should keep it small. Isabella is still fragile. Fragile. The word had migrated. It no longer belonged to me, but the sympathy did. And sympathy determines gravity. On Christmas morning, Daniel and I stayed home. It was peaceful, but it was clear. I hadn't destroyed her. I had displaced her, and she refused displacement. Months later, I learned the full story. She had told extended family that I had attacked her while she was undergoing treatment, that I had used her medical vulnerability to embarrass her publicly. She never denied spreading the original rumor. She reframed it as a misunderstanding. But my correction, that was deliberate harm. In families, perception outweighs chronology, and the person who cries first often writes history. Daniel remained steady. He suggested distance. Not exile, he said, just distance. So we withdrew. Birthdays became cards instead of appearances. Holidays became travel plans. Gradually, we built a life that did not require their table. Years passed. Isabella eventually had a child. The announcement came through a group message. I replied with a polite congratulations. No one commented on the silence between us. They simply stepped around it. When our daughter was born 2 years later, we didn't host a christening. We didn't host anything. I had learned something hard. Correction does not guarantee reconciliation. Sometimes it simply clarifies alignment. One afternoon, years later, I ran into Isabella at a school function. Our children stood side by side, unaware of inherited fractures. She looked at me, not angry, not tearful, just distant. You could have handled it differently, she said quietly. So could you, I replied. We stood there for a moment, two women who once shared a bedroom, now sharing nothing but history. There was no apology, no breakthrough, just understanding. We were never rivals. We were two people who wanted to be seen, and when only one spotlight existed, we fought for it. I didn't regret correcting the lie, but I did accept the cost. Truth restores self-respect. It does not guarantee belonging. 10 years later, our lives run parallel. Family events are divided subtly, invitations negotiated, stories curated. There is no open war, only permanent distance. And sometimes in the quiet of my kitchen at night, I wonder, if I had chosen the grenade instead of the table, would it have ended faster? Or would it have burned everything beyond repair? Some fractures heal crooked, some never fuse at all. This was the version where clarity survived, but the relationship didn't. It didn't start with a confession. It started with a hesitation. After the Sunday lunch, after the document, after the room shifted, Daniel became careful, not defensive. Careful. When Isabella came to the house and admitted she'd been projecting her fertility struggle onto me, something in Daniel's expression flickered. Too quickly, too subtly. But I've been married long enough to recognize micro-expressions. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition. At first, I told myself I was overthinking. Stress distorts perception. But then I began noticing small fractures. Daniel avoided eye contact when Isabella's name came up. Daniel insists we not dig further. Daniel said. It's done. Let's move on. He has never been a man who avoids closure, unless closure threatens him. The confirmation didn't come dramatically. It came digitally. A shared iPad. A notification banner. Isabella, we can't keep talking like this. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. When I opened the thread, my hands didn't shake. They went cold. The messages weren't romantic. They were intimate in a different way. Private jokes, emotional venting, late-night conversations during her treatment cycles. He had been her confidant, not me. He knew about the injections, the hormone swings, the failed implantation. He knew before I did. And in the worst months, when she felt alone, she had leaned on him. He told her she was strong. He told her she deserved happiness. He told her Oliver didn't understand. There was one message that hollowed me out. I wish things were different. No elaboration, but context filled the gap. Suddenly, the rumor made sense. Why was she so comfortable discussing IVF details? Why had Daniel been so calm when relatives mentioned it? Why did he never seem surprised? Because in some twisted way, the story had always been adjacent to him. She wasn't just redirecting shame. She was entangling him, and maybe, just maybe, protecting something else. When I confronted him, I didn't scream. I showed him the screen. He went pale. It wasn't like that, he said immediately. It's exactly like that, I replied. He insisted it was emotional support. That she needed someone stable. That he didn't want to burden me. Burden me. The irony was surgical. You let them believe I was broken, I said quietly. I didn't think it would go that far. That is what people say when they benefit from silence. The deeper truth unfolded slowly. There had been no physical affair, but emotional betrayal does not require touch. It requires intimacy redirected. He had become her safe place. She had become his validation. In supporting her fertility struggle, he stepped into a role that didn't belong to him. And when she began projecting the IVF narrative onto me, he didn't stop her. Because stopping her would expose the private channel between them. The rumor wasn't just convenient for Isabella. It was protective for Daniel. If the family believed I was undergoing IVF, no one would question why Daniel seemed so informed. Why did he use clinical language? Why did he seem emotionally invested? The lie covered both of them. When I confronted Isabella, she didn't deny the messages. She didn't cry. She just looked tired. It wasn't physical, she said. You think that's the line? I asked. She looked at Daniel then, and in that look I saw something worse than passion. Dependence. He had been her anchor, and she had been his admiration. Two people orbiting each other under the guise of a crisis. The most painful part wasn't betrayal. It was a realization. While I was maintaining composure, documenting rumors, protecting dignity, they were building a quiet alliance. Not lovers, but something dangerously close. And when I placed that medical document on the table, I hadn't just corrected a lie. I had destabilized their secret ecosystem. That's why Daniel wanted it to end quickly. That's why Isabella escalated emotionally. I had threatened more than my reputation. I had threatened proximity. We didn't divorce immediately. That would have been simpler. Instead, we entered the long, quiet war of therapy, of rebuilding transparency, of dismantling emotional triangles. He cut contact with her beyond necessary family logistics. She withdrew completely. Family gatherings became sterile, polite, measured. No one else knew the full truth. They thought the crisis was about IVF gossip. They didn't know the real fracture had nothing to do with fertility. It had to do with emotional loyalty. In this version of the story, we survive. But survival is not the same as innocence. Daniel remains my husband, but he is no longer untarnished in memory. Isabella remains my sister, but she is no longer simply insecure. They were two lonely people who found comfort in each other's validation, and I was the stable ground they stood on, until I moved. There is something colder than anger. Clarity. In this version, the lie wasn't just displacement. It was camouflage. And when I stepped out of the narrative publicly, I exposed more than I intended. 10 years later, we meet at a cafe halfway between our houses. Neutral territory. Not our mother's dining table. Not a holiday gathering. Not somewhere layered with history. Just a place with soft lighting and mismatched chairs. Isabella arrives first this time. She looks older, of course. We both do. But softer around the edges. Less sharpened by comparison. We ordered tea. For a few minutes, we talk about logistics. Children, school schedules, work, then the silence shifts. Not awkward. Intentional. I've been thinking about that year, she says. I don't pretend to know which one. So have I reply. Isabella, I used to rehearse this conversation in my head. In those versions, I was either defensive or devastated. Today, I'm neither. I don't think I ever said this properly, I begin. I wasn't trying to hurt you. She doesn't nod automatically anymore. She waits. I know, she says. But you did. There's no accusation in it, just a fact. That makes it easier to stay honest. I was drowning, I say, and you were steady. It felt like you had oxygen. I didn't. She almost smiles at that. I didn't, she says. I just panicked privately. That surprises me. Lucinda, for years I thought she envied my stability. It turns out she misinterpreted it. You think I wasn't affected? I ask gently. She shakes her head. You never looked it. That doesn't mean I wasn't. I tell her something I've never said aloud. Being the strong one is lonely. She absorbs that. I didn't realize I was using you, she says quietly. You were, I answer. But I also allowed it. She frowns. How? I benefited from being the stable one. It gave me identity, too. That's the part I learned slowly. Roles protect both sides. Isabella, I thought if you ever needed something, I say carefully, you'd just take it. She tilts her head. Take what? Attention, sympathy, space. She laughs softly. That's not how it works. I didn't need less. I just needed different. The cafe hums around us. No one here knows what we were to each other. No one knows how sharp that year felt. I hated that you didn't fall apart, I admit. She doesn't flinch. I know, she says. You knew? Yes. That lands heavily. Lucinda, I had known. Resentment has a temperature. You can feel it radiating. I didn't fall apart because someone had to stay vertical, I say. She exhales slowly. I never asked you to carry me. No, I agree, but you assumed I could. There it is. Not cruelty. Assumption. Isabella, I was ashamed, I say. The word still tastes metallic. I know, she replies. We sit with that. I thought if people pitied you, they'd stop measuring me. I continue. I didn't think you'd care. I cared, she says. I just didn't explode. That's the difference between us. I externalize. She internalizes. Both cost something. Lucinda, I could have exposed you completely, I say, not threatening, just acknowledging history. I know, she replies. Why didn't you? She asks. I think about it. Because I didn't want to win. I wanted it to stop. Her eyes gloss slightly. That restraint changed me, she says. You know that, right? I hoped it might. Isabella, there's something freeing about saying this now. I don't compete with you anymore. She studies me. Good, she says. Because I stopped competing years ago. We both smile at the absurdity of how long it took. Do you trust me, I ask? She considers carefully. Yes, she says finally. But not blindly. That feels fair. I don't trust myself blindly either, I admit. Lucinda, time has done something that confrontation couldn't. It has removed urgency. I don't need us to be identical, I tell her. I just need us to be honest. I can do honest, she says. I believe her. Not because she sounds convincing, because she sounds tired of pretending. Isabella, as we stand to leave, I say the thing that once would have been impossible. I admire you. She raises an eyebrow. For what? For not collapsing into who they expected you to be. She pauses. I admire you, she replies. For finally refusing to. That feels even. We step outside into the afternoon light. No grand reconciliation. No dramatic embrace. Just two women who finally understand that neither strength nor vulnerability is a weapon unless misused. We walk to our car separately, but lighter, not because the past disappeared, because it's no longer competing with the present. And for the first time in our lives, we are not roles. We are simply sisters.